Hi, thank you all for coming today to the Wilson Center. I'm Megan Parker. I'm the Senior Writer-Editor for the Environmental Change and Security Program here at the Center. The Wilson Center is the formal living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, and we are a nonpartisan, non-advocacy forum for the study of international affairs. So thank you for coming here. We're here today to talk about A River Runs Again, a brilliant new book by Mira Subramian. And Mira is a freelance journalist who has long written about environmental issues and published in many, many different outlets, including New York Times, Nature, Orion, Virginia Quarterly Review, Wall Street Journal, and many others. This is her first book, and it's also available for sale outside. She will be signing copies at the reception, so I hope you all will stay for that after the event. She is also a current, she earned a master's in journalism from New York University, and her writing on the disappearance of India's vultures received both the Blackford Prize for nonfiction and first place for outstanding feature story from the Society of Environmental Journalists Awards. And that this book includes some of that work on vultures, which is, I think, inspired it. We'll hear more from her in a minute. I was really, really excited when Mira reached out to us about hosting the book launch here at the center, because it exemplifies a principle that we really hold dear here at the Environmental Change and Security Program, which is that environmental issues are deeply connected to the essential elements of life, to food, to water, to health, and that women's health, and particularly access to reproductive health and rights, is an inseparable part of that story. I'm also thrilled because Mira is a member of SEJ, the Society of Environmental Journalists. In fact, all of us up here are members of SEJ, and we all just returned from the conference in Norman, Oklahoma, where Mira and Lisa spoke about this book at a standing room only panel session. After Mira presents about the book, Lisa and Priyali will share their thoughts based on their recent reporting about India and elsewhere on these issues. So I'm looking forward as well to a discussion not only about the issues in the book, but also about the challenges and opportunities of reporting on them. I highly, highly recommend this book, but you don't have to just take my word for it. Bill McKibben says, "What happens in India may turn out, even more than China, to be the key to the kind of environmental future the planet faces. Very few people are qualified to tell the story with as much clarity, compassion, and character-driven power as Mira Subramian." So. And there's many other great testimonials to the book. And please, feel free to step out, pick up your copy, or get it during the reception as well. Mira?
Thank you, Megan. Thank you. Yeah, I'm very delighted to be here because Woodrow Wilson Center definitely is the type of place that addresses the exact type of questions that I was looking at with this book. And I wrote A River Runs Again hoping to spur conversation, so that is what I hope this will be today. I'm glad we have plenty of time at the end to talk not only with my fellow panelists, but just with all of you here sitting here today. So I just want to give you just a little bit of a backstory of how this book came to be and why it took the shape that it did, and then I'll briefly outline the contents of it, and then at the end I'll just read one short excerpt from it as well. A River Runs Again is fundamentally a story about India and the people that I met there and the small organizations that were working to try to transform and deal with extremely challenging environmental crises that they're dealing with on multiple fronts. And many times they were responding to these with incredible small-scale efforts that were having an effect in transforming their own lives and landscapes. So this is fundamentally a book about India, but part of the reason that I came to write it comes from my own background. I was born and raised in New Jersey, but my father was born and raised in South India. And so he came to America in 1959. He was the first person in his family to leave India, and he came here on a ship to get a graduate degree, and then the plan was to go back and settle down to an arranged marriage as per tradition. So he got the degree, which made everyone very happy, and then he also proposed to my fair-skinned mother from Chicago, which made people not so happy. So that can divide families permanently, and I really hold great respect for my father because he not only wanted to maintain the connection that he had to his family in India, but he felt it was really important for us, the family that he was creating in America, to also have a strong connection to India. So we went there. We went there a lot. Let's see if I can. French. Should I use the clicker?
I'll use the clicker.
It's changing here, but not there. What would you suggest?
Is it on?
You guys you have to just wait on the edges of your seats to see me as an 18-month-old baby arriving in India for my very first trip. Do you want to just see if we're in the right display mode? So basically, we went to India. We went the first time when I was in 1972, when I was 18 months old, and we were just surrounded by this whole entourage of family. Okay, there we go. And this. No.
It's a magic touch.
That's the laser beam. This worked 10 times before you all entered the room. I spent my good luck. The karma's gone. So
you took it off the.
we went to India repeatedly throughout my whole life, and each time I went, I was a different person when I would go to India. Sometimes I was totally into it when I was 10, and other times I was a bratty teenager who wanted to go home. But it was India that was ultimately going through a major transformation in that time frame, and that really kicked in, especially in the 1990s, when economic reforms opened up in India's economy in a way that it had never experienced before. It had been a borderlines, like semi-socialist nation for most of its existence as an independent nation, and in the early 90s they had economic reforms that just opened it up to the global economy. Oh yeah, there I am. So now what do I do? Clicker? Ah. And as those economic reforms were happening, India was utterly changing from this was where my father was born in this village in South India, and then you started seeing things like this, the National Stock Exchange. So that change was part of, this change just basically made it seemed like, we started hearing stories about the IT boom. We started hearing stories about, I realized I didn't have to spell my name when I called India on 1-800 numbers anymore. So there was all these transformations happening. But the question was whether they were really happening. What were those changes looking like on the ground? Sorry, this is, okay, there we go.
Can you maybe do the clicker and then she'll do the other one?
That might be good. So I'm going to have us do a little experiment to give an idea of the changes that were happening and were not happening in that time frame. Now we've had a full generation of that economic blooming that's been happening in India, but the numbers show something a lot more troubling. So I'm going to pretend we in this room are 1.2 billion people. We have now just transformed magically into the population of India. New numbers that are coming from the UN are showing that India is going to outpace China as the most populous nation by 2022. So that's 7 years from now. We're looking at India being the most populous nation on earth. So what's happening in India is something that we should be looking at. Like there are definitely, and it was part of what drew me there for the book, was just looking at the fact that the interface of population pressures with hitting natural resource limitations is at its utmost in India, but I feel like we're all dealing with that and all heading in that same direction now everywhere. So out of the 1.2 billion people in India, us here in this room, about 60% of you don't have access to clean water. You might have access to water, but it might be water that makes you or your children sick, or create so many problems within your intestinal distress that your child can't even absorb the nutrients that they might have. And even more than that, about 2/3 are cooking over an open fire. And that's, most of the men are off the hook in that bunch, but the women and the girls are collecting firewood and dealing with the implications of cooking over those smoky fires. And then about a quarter of you don't have any electricity. And I feel like this really came to light when there was a huge blackout in June of 2012 that swept over all of North India. So 600 million people lived in the region where this blackout happened. But the more striking number is that half of those people didn't have any electricity in the first place. So we're talking about, pretty much the equivalent of the population of the United States that just didn't have access to power. We might have been reading about it on our iPads on the New York Times cover, but they might have not even known that the power was out in the first place because it was just a typical day. So that brings up the question of how do you get those resources to people? India wants to develop its citizenry and get those development aspects to everyone who needs them and wants them. But how do we do that? How do we get more water, more power, more food, houses that don't tumble down in earthquakes? How do we do that without just wrecking and ravaging the planet in the process of getting those resources? To deal with that question was, I wanted to make, it can be slightly overwhelming and slightly depressing, but we're here at the Woodrow Wilson Center because we believe that there are solutions to these, and we're trying to actively have conversations and figure out how to make those solutions see the light of day. So in terms of addressing the stories of India that I wanted to go find in pursuit of these questions about how do we bring these resources to people without ravaging the planet in the process. Please step in. Do anything you want.
But it's not on the screen. I think we just have a disconnect.
There's a disconnect. We're trying to reconnect the disconnect. So in order to bring these stories to light, I used a combination of basically storytelling and science. I approached journalism as a narrative journalist, hoping to just find people that can tell me the stories and using that as a way to look at larger issues. And I'm also a total science geek, so I would also pursue all of the academic research and scientists who could help me corroborate what I was seeing on the ground and what people are experiencing in their day-to-day lived lives with what they are, with what the science is saying on the larger scale. So I brought together this science and storytelling, and then also to give it a framework so it wasn't completely overwhelming, tackling something as big as the environment in a place like India, was to use the 5 elements as a framework. So that's this has been a cross-cultural, across time, across cultures. Humans have always tried to make sense of their world, often through defining the elements that they see as being the stuff that makes their world around them. So I focused in on the Pancha Mahabhuta, which was the Sanskrit version of the Hindu cosmology of earth, water, fire, air, and ether. And so I looked at those 5 elements and found stories from each of those elements that reflected a larger story about the environment, and that's how I approached the whole book. What I loved was that they were incredibly messy. They bled into each other in wonderfully rich ways because that's what they do. You can't talk about earth and organic agriculture without talking about water, and you can't talk about fire and the pollution that's caused by cook stoves without talking about women. And so all these issues bled together. So I'm just going to briefly go through the 5 sections, and then I will read to you from the last one, and then we can open it up to everybody. I just in case I had printed these up. I'm still a Luddite at heart. Yeah, that's fine.
But the other option would be if you have your notes.
I have my notes.
Then you can just.
They just don't get to see the pretty pictures, but.
Well, no, I think you could run this in a non-presenter mode.
Oh, okay. Well, let's do that. We're going to run in non-presenter mode, and I'm going to read from my notes as needed. So the first element was earth. And so for earth, I went to look at the rise of organic agriculture as a response to the Green Revolution. So I went to, the Karnataka part of the piece made the subtitle of the book, but for the most part I was focusing on Punjab, which is way in the northwest corner and of the country. Tiny portion of the country, like less than 2% of the landmass. Yay! Thank you. So ether, everything in between. I went all over the country. I was very fortunate to have support from SEJ. I got some funding. I got a Fulbright scholarship. Little book deals from the U.S. and from India. U.S. and India both helped, and as well as working on pieces for Nature and Virginia Quarterly Review. All of these wonderful support systems for freelance journalists helped me get to many parts of the country. So this is Earth. These are these fun little drawings. This was the funnest part of the book, was doing these little drawings for the book at the end. So for Earth, most of my research was focused up in Punjab, which is way up there in the left upper hand corner in the northwest. Famine is a very real concern for India. Just a few years before independence, they had the Bengal famines that millions of people died. So when they became independent, they were highly dependent on imports for food, and they were very focused on figuring out how they could grow their own food. So when the Green Revolution showed up in the 50s and 60s, coming from the West, it was greatly welcome. This small area of Punjab, like I was saying, is just 2% of the country, but they produce the vast majority of the food. It's definitely the breadbasket of India. So if you're going to grow lots of food in the breadbasket, then the Green Revolution offered a way to do that. The package deal of the Green Revolution was basically high-yield seeds that worked in conjunction with a host of applications of pesticides and fertilizers, along with nice, solid use of water. So that system worked amazingly well. In the beginning, many of these things were given for free or highly subsidized. They still are extremely subsidized, and the yields grew exponentially for a while. And then the yield started to plateau, and some of the effectiveness of the methods began to not be so effective, and yields started either plateauing or going down. It also meant that there were chemicals just everywhere. Here's a tote bag made out of a chemical bag. Perhaps you remember that 24 Bihari school children died when they put vegetable cooking oil in a used container that had once held monocrotophos. So that was like another. These chemicals are just everywhere in the landscape. It means they also have saturated the water. Nitrate levels have gone up tenfold since the Green Revolution has started in India, and the water depletion is huge. The water table in Punjab in particular is basically in free fall. So I went seeking out the people who were looking for alternatives to this system. They were wanting to either return to something that was a little more akin to what their grandfathers had done, or they wanted to be more high tech. And I met engineers who were returning to the farm, much in the way that we sort of have an artisanal upper Hudson River Valley form of agriculture, and they were supplying five-star hotels in Bangalore. So farmers are approaching this for various reasons, but all are looking for a way to be more sustainable and to farm for the long term. So again, these are some of the farmers that I met. Is it working? My kind of driving question for this part of the book is, will India starve? Like, let's take this argument to the end and say, if India went organic overnight, would India starve? And here are two brothers who, the one on the left says, absolutely not. He's working his part of the father's land organically, and the one on the right with the orange scarf saying, we definitely will, and he's working his half of the father's land with chemicals in a conventional format. And I met people everywhere who were on both sides of this argument. Many, this is a man named Gaurav Singh, who he was transitioning his land gradually, because it takes time to transition. If you've been saturating the soil with chemicals, you've essentially killed the soil. And so it takes time to replenish it and bring it back to life in order to support a sustainable system. So farmers like Gaurav were very common, where he was starting to transition half of his lands to organic. That was notably the half that he kept for his own family to eat, and then the rest would go to market. And he would, I sat with him on his land, and he scooped up with his knife. He scooped up some of the soil, and he's just like, "Smell this! It smells so good. Like chemical soil. It's smells terrible. And he was just talking about this very visceral reaction to it that he has as a farmer in touch with his land. But again, trying to back that up with the science, and the science says exactly what this farmer who has 5 acres in Punjab is seeing. And we saw this a lot, there was a lot of talk about Oklahoma, where we all were just last week. This was Dust Bowl country, and I didn't even realize this until I learned just last week, that they just came out of a drought in May. They came out of a drought that was more intense than the Dust Bowl years. It luckily didn't last as long, but it was just as intense in terms of the temperatures. It's getting worse and worse. When they came out of the drought, they came out of the drought with 2 years worth of rain in 2 months. So these extremes are becoming more and more part of the story of what we're experiencing around the globe. So again, how farmers are dealing with this in India is not so different than how farmers are going to need to deal with this in Oklahoma or in our own breadbasket. So the science is there, and the science was really, really encouraging. There's a place in Michigan called the Kellogg Biological Station. They've been studying inputs with organic agriculture and effects on land for 25 years now. It's funded by the National Science Foundation. And what they're finding is that they're finding this threshold that you can lower the nitrogen inputs and do other things that are more sustainable, like intersperse with cover cropping that helps fix nitrogen naturally. And when you find those thresholds, then the nitrogen isn't running off and killing the Mississippi and creating the dead zone down in the Gulf, and the yields are comparable to high-intensive petrochemical agriculture. So they're playing around with the hard science to figure out how can we calibrate the system. Maybe it's not going organic overnight. Maybe it is just figuring out how much we can decrease those inputs and do these other things that Gaura Singh's grandfather did without thinking for hundreds of years of how these systems have been maintained. Find that balance. So that's what they're looking for. Other really encouraging research has been coming out of Africa, where 35 million acres have been using agroforestry, where you look at the entire system, and they're getting yields that are increasing and actually being more productive than even with conventional agriculture. All of this stuff helps build the soil for a long term, which is also a huge carbon input. We always think, plant a tree to store carbon, but it's actually the soil. Oceans hold the most, but the soil holds the second most, more than the air and more than all of the flora and fauna that is on Earth. So these are places that are becoming more and more important when we're looking at carbon. I should jump to the next section. Water was the next section. So water took me to Rajasthan, just southwest of Delhi a little bit. And this was an area that was a semi-arid landscape, already very dry, very dependent on brief fleeting monsoon rains that are becoming more and more erratic. And by the 60s or so, the population increase and the pressures and the erratic nature of the monsoons was just too much, and the place had basically dried up. Most agriculture had withered. There was enough water to get by for household needs, but there wasn't enough to sustain agriculture and livestock. So most of the men had basically left, and the landscape had pretty much died. And then this man, Rajendra Singh, who is now known as the Rain Man of Rajasthan, he was a Gandhian revolutionary. He went out there wanting to start a hospital or something, and as he tells the story, an old man just pretty much took him by the ear and said, we don't need schools, we don't need hospitals. What we actually really, really need is water. And Rajendra says, okay, well, what do you want me to do about this? And the old man points to this spot and he says, build a dam. The waters come here and then they just run away. We need to stop the water to help it stay put. You build a dam. And as he tells it, he ate lentils for 3 years and built a dam. He took me to, and everybody thought he was crazy. And then all of the wells that were in that area started coming back to life. And so they have now replicated this model all across the region. They've built thousands of dams, all very small scale. This is kind of one of the more medium ones that actually had concrete. I saw women working on one that was just dirt. Kanahia, who I write about extensively in the book, has been working with this organization for years, and he took me to his village that he was very proud Prince Charles had been to, because this place has just really shown how it it can take care of its own resources in a long-term way. And I think this area really showed just the power of these small-scale efforts when implemented on broadly across the landscape, because this was not a big thing. And again, I'm thinking of Oklahoma, I'm thinking of places like Texas and California that are dealing with just receiving intermittent rains for brief periods of time. What do you do to capitalize on capturing that to help recharge groundwater systems that are suffering? So this is behind one of the dams. Somebody was just planting trees all around it and just trying to encourage the whole system. And so this is basically looking at the valley. I have a slight epiphany from this from this vantage towards the end of the book that I write about. But this this whole area right here had been not functioning a generation ago, and now it was actively being farmed. The fire story was really complicated. It was probably the one that I spent the most time on in some respects. I was basically investigating the way, remember the 2/3 of you who are cooking over an open fire? This is a huge development issue. It took me all over the country pursuing some of these stories. I was basically went, oh, well, here, so, and you see evidence of this everywhere. Women collecting firewood, you see kids scrambling up trees that are already hacked to pieces. This is from Bihar. These are cow dung patties drying on the side of a home. The issue of these fires in terms of the human health impact is huge. Global burden of disease study comes out periodically. They're bringing in all this multidisciplinary research to figure out what is killing people around the world. And cook stoves is by far it's huge. It's 4 million a year that they estimate are dying because of the smoke, inhaling the smoke. So this is more than malaria, tuberculosis, and HIV/AIDS combined. This is a huge, huge health impact, hitting women and children more because they are the ones that are often the ones there in the kitchens dealing with this. Simultaneously, the recognition of how much of a climate impact this has is also increasing. So black soot that comes from these fires is the soot is being found thousands of miles from where it's generated. There's a 2-mile thick black cloud over South Asia that is in large part is being caused by these domestic fires. It's a huge problem on multiple levels. So there have been all these amazing NGOs, including one that I worked with when I was in my 20s in Oregon. I was working at a place called Aprovecho that has designed fuel-efficient wood cook stoves for the developing world for 30 years. In fact, this stove that we're looking at right here is called an EnviroFit stove. It's based on some of the design principles that were developed at that research center I was working at in Oregon. These stoves are all over the world. The Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves is based here in DC, and they've got very lofty goals of trying to get these stoves to people. And this is an awesome picture of how great these stoves could be. There's like no smoke coming from this at all. It's a beautiful, clean fire. If I went into details of what happened to get this picture, because what I found on the ground was that these stoves were just not being used. This was kind of like, oh yeah, sure, we'll get it here from this back closet, and maybe we'll put a little kerosene on it to get it really going first. It was the reality is that often these stoves just do not seem to fit the lives of the people who they are being either given or sold to, and there's all these different reasons for why that's happening. It's a gender issue, because if there's expendable income to spend on an improved stove like this, the male of the household might have control of the purse strings, and the last thing he's going to spend it on is a cook stove that's going to help his wife. Even women themselves just have an association that where there's fire, there's smoke. That there's not really a concept that there can be something else, or that these stoves are smokeless because you have to break up the wood really small. It's kind of a pain. I'd much rather stick a big log in it because I got other things to be doing around the house. So there's all these reasons why these stories are really complicated. And some of the hope I found seemed to come from what looks like quite a messy kitchen, but this is in Tamil Nadu, where it's a little bit more developed on some levels. And this home was relying on 4 different energy sources. They were looking at LPG and kerosene and coke stove that was outside that was just a 3-stone fire that was using coconut fronds, all these different methods. And so this is basically stove stacking, and this is essentially what we're all doing here with an electric kettle and a microwave and a hot water heater in the closet. But that's not a bad thing. It seems like heading in that direction where people have options, and also considering that if clean cook stoves, which have been being promoted for 40 years, have never really taken on, whether people who are working on development need to be asking different questions about whether there are fundamental reasons why this is just not going to take off, and whether there needs to be more efforts towards leapfrogging those technologies to something that people want, and that we in the developed country would even be willing to use ourselves. Vultures was, as Megan said, this was kind of where the story began for me when I worked on a piece for Virginia Quarterly Review. It was a fascinating story of cultural and religious and ecological factors all coming together. Basically, some of these wonderful photos are from a photographer named Amy Vitale in this section. In the 90s, vultures started just falling dead from trees. Nobody had any idea why. A conservation team came together and basically figured out that it was an innocuous NSAID, basically a painkiller akin to ibuprofen, that humans have been taking for decades. Farmers began to give it to their livestock. So if you have a limping cow, you want to get him through the harvest season, you give him some of the painkiller to keep him from limping, but he's sick. The cow dies, vultures feed on the carcass, and for reasons they still don't physiologically understand, it causes renal failure and the vultures die. So they had a huge collapse of the population in very short order. In about 10 years, they had a 97 to 99% decline of 3 gyps species of vultures. So there were, who knows how many there were. The number says 40 million, but there were so many that nobody had ever bothered to count them, kind of like pigeons here. Like nobody took pictures of them. They just didn't even pay any attention. They were just these vultures. You just don't look, right? And then they were gone. So I followed this story all over India. I followed the biologist who has been monitoring nest sites since before they even figured out what the decline was, to try to monitor the populations with the last numbers that they had. He told me, nature basically doesn't like a vacuum, so the question ecologically was what was filling that vacuum? And there are a few graphic images coming up here just to warn you. It seems like feral dogs is what's filling the niche. Then the numbers have gone up a lot since then. There's a huge protein source with these carcasses that now end up at carcass dumps where they used to just be cleaned up by the vultures in the fields. And so these are dogs, whole big bunches of dogs running around causes a much greater health risk to humans than vultures ever did. So that's kind of troubling. Then you go to Mumbai, where you go to the fanciest, poshest neighborhood in Malabar Hill, and the Parsis, which is a small religious group that is mostly based there in Mumbai, for thousands of years have laid out their dead on the Towers of Silence. This is an old archival photo, and the vultures used to just come and eat the bodies, and the sky burial was this perfect system that had been in existence for so long. And then the vultures vanished, and they have been really scrambling to try to figure out how to adapt to that system and stay true to what their principles believe, which is that you can't cremate a body or bury a body because that's polluting these sacred elements of fire and earth. And I also went to the breeding center. They are trying to do conservation breeding. They're actually pretty successful. The numbers have been going up. It's a tricky bird just biologically because they're slow breeders and they don't much like being in aviaries, but the conservationists I met were doing really a great job of perfecting these techniques. What they need, though, is for there not to be any diclofenac anymore in the landscape of South Asia before they can start releasing these birds. So that got one step closer just a couple months ago when they reduced the vial size. So they used to do these multi-dose vials for humans. India had banned veterinary diclofenac, pretty soon after they figured out what was going on. So that was great, but the black market was such that it was still really easy for veterinarians to get a hold of the multi-dose vials and use it on the cows. So just finally, after years of battling, the big vials are gone, which means it's back to little human-sized vials, and the hope is that it just makes it that much more inconvenient that vets will just say, we'll use the meloxicam as a vulture-safe painkiller that works on livestock. So the hope is that these little things will have an effect and they can start releasing some of these birds. This is the conservation biology team. And then the last section is ether, and I wanted to address population issues, which can be sometimes kind of a tricky subject to address, but it's a huge part of the equation when you're looking at natural resource limitations. Every miracle of life that is born is another human body that is going to need those resources for its entire life, and hopefully enough to sustain it and give it a healthy, fulfilling life in the process. So I went, in this section, I went to Bihar, which is a state with some of the youngest brides. The girl in red was 14 and had been married for a year. And it also has some of the highest birth rates in the country. And I went there at a kind of intense time. It was basically, my visit was bookended by Malala Yousafzai being shot in the head by the Taliban for her advocating for girls' education. And then very soon after I left was the really brutal gang rape in Delhi that brought people out in the streets and rose a lot of awareness around the sexual brutality that women are facing in India. So, but the more encouraging thing was that I saw amazing power in the knowledge that was being given to young girls and what they were doing with that. I went and talked with almost everybody who was dealing with population on any level in Bihar. I ended up focusing specifically on Pathfinder International, which is was being run by Pinky Kumari, who's in this picture, and another man, Binod Singh. And they were giving basically just very simple 3-day reproductive health and sexual training to teenagers in Bihar. And I will just read a short section that is going to focus on Soba, who's here in the middle picture, shown with her mother and Binod Singh. And then I'll just do a quick wrap-up and we can have a conversation, yeah? So we were in Bodh Gaya, which is where the Buddha found enlightenment and is a major pilgrimage site. On the far side of town, miles from the sacred tree, Pinky, Binod, and I arrived at the Sujatakuti Stupa, named after the maiden who brought kheer, a mixture of rice, milk, and honey to the Buddha soon after enlightenment. The site had no ticket booths or metal detectors like the Mahabodhian temple, where there had been recent terrorist threats. Tucked behind the nondescript dome of stone that marked the spot was a village ringed by fields of ripening cabbage and eggplant. Across from the stupa was a small brick schoolhouse, just one room, and inside there was enough room for us to sit in a circle on a thin, damp rug, 24 teenagers who had come from the villages to meet us. The girls outnumbered the boys. All had gone through a 3-day training session that Pathfinder offered on basic reproductive and sexual health, part of its Prachar program, which means to promote in Hindi. Some of the boys and girls were also involved with another Pathfinder program called Jagriti, which means awakening, that aims to end child marriage, a practice that was banned in 2006 but remains commonplace. The enclosed space was illuminated by dim daylight that seeped in through half-shuttered windows and lit their young faces in the faded blue plaster walls. Each person shared a story. By most accounts, the 3-day Pathfinder training initiative was transformative. The kids used the term Jagriti frequently as they spoke of their own awakenings. They seemed enraptured with Pinky and Binod, and why wouldn't they be? Binod was charming and informative. He teased and he joked. Pinky was, for them, a rare example of a working woman, happy and passionate and brazenly or baffingly without either a husband or a child at the age of 30, which is nearly unheard of in rural India. Nobody else had ever told these teens that they had the right to make decisions about their own lives. No one had offered them practical information about topics ordinarily considered taboo, and thus made all the more alluring. It's up to you to decide when you should marry, Pinky and Binod told their students. Wait until at least the legal age of 18 and stay in school as long as you can. You and your spouse can decide how many children to have and when to have them. It is your right to control your fertility. The class learned about basic contraception, that it's impossible for an IUD to end up in your brain or your windpipe, that it is the father's biological contribution that determines a child's gender with a tiny thing called a chromosome. So if anyone is to be blamed for the unfortunate arrival of a girl child, it is the father. The girls loved this fact and repeated it often. Soba was the most self-possessed. Her forehead was marked with a sparkly bindi that matched an S-shaped pendant hanging from her neck. She sat attentively as the others spoke, only once interjecting, "We should say the truth." But once she had the floor, she commanded the room. All distracted chatter stopped. "What sort of place is this, you'll say if you come to my village? From Bodh Gaya, there's a river and a hill, and behind them is a village, like a cave. People were afraid to go inside," she said. "Even my father didn't want to stay in the village. It was claustrophobic." There had been changes. Some villagers now had phones, and one road was being paved. She learned about the Pathfinder training course from village elders who said that all girls between 15 and 18 should attend. "But my situation was common in the village," she said, "where each household might have 6 sisters, 5 sisters. So we made a group with at least one girl from each house. And we took the training and we went back to teach others." She had to periodically gulp to catch her breath, as though she had been waiting a very long time to speak. Soba said she was able to get a Pathfinder poster of the life cycle of a human being passing from birth through adolescence, followed by marriage and a young couple, weighing birth control options, and later holding a child as it is being immunized. The poster is actually up there next to her mother. It was like posted up in her home. She used the poster to begin talking with others in the village. Pinky and Binod exchanged looks. They had no idea that one of their students had gone rogue and appointed herself as a trainer. When Soba finished, Pinky asked if she would continue to work with Pathfinder to organize more trainings. Soba eagerly agreed. We emerged from the small schoolhouse and into an afternoon damp with mist. Though their hair was neatly pulled back and their clothes were modest, I saw the girls as powerful goddesses, Devis eager for justice, who stepped in where the male gods were failing, determined to quietly or not so quietly dismantle a world that treats them as second-rate citizens. To stabilize population growth is to rally for literacy, because reading and understanding words on a page develops the same skills needed to read and understand our own bodies. Through this knowledge comes power and autonomy, and speech. The girls I met in Bihar who had their Jagriti awakening spoke in feisty voices, their excitement coupled with impatience as they told the stories of their lives. What they found was that learning how to speak to a husband, a mother-in-law, a doctor, a police officer is a powerful tool. With this transformation of a private voice into a public identity is born, one prepared to dissent and to stand up for oneself. People ask us, "Why do you go to these meetings? Do they give you something?" Rima Kumari, an 18-year-old Bihari girl, told me. I say, "When you go to pray, do you get something?" They say, "Well, that one girl who did the training, she met a boy and she ran away." She laughed and continued speaking quickly in a strong voice. We argue back, "You had her for 15 years and they had her for 3 days, and you're saying we influenced her? There's a flaw in your nurturing, not in our friendship." "You fight back with your parents," I said. "Hum bolte hai," she said. "We speak up. Before training, we didn't know anything, but after we do. We learned how to find the right words to negotiate. There are so many changes." To negotiate such changes is to ask for everything you want, knowing you might only get a fraction. It is to remain unflinching as you look forward into the future of India's women and girls and the generations they will bear. The path ahead is difficult, littered with obstacles still under construction. But I can imagine the youth I met in Bodh Gaya growing up in this new India, their India, moving forward down this road together. They shape the way as they go. They link their fingers, they quicken their pace, and their voices, rising up into that space between spaces, are unafraid. So just in conclusion, somewhere. These papers. That India is at a crossroads. It really feels like India is ready to head in a direction of it wants to develop its country and its resources and its people. And Prime Minister Modi was voted in last year on that platform. But what I found through working on this book was that there's 2 very, very different roads that could happen on. And one seemed to me like what I was seeing was this model of the micro, where people are doing things on a small scale, broadly implemented, and trying to initiate these changes within their own community. The level of the macro, I realized, was like last century's model. It was last century when we were building gigantic power plants and mega dams and doing really, really large-scale things. And we've learned that a lot in industrial agriculture, we've learned what the price of a lot of those systems are. They take a long time to put in place. They require immense amounts of capital going in, and when they fail, they can fail kind of catastrophically. And so the question I felt like I came out with is like, are there ways to support the approach of the micro, renewable energy systems that are nimble and agile and can be changed as new technology comes in and switched out constantly, just like the way that we're upgrading our phones and our computers. Like the renewable, the prices have come down substantially for renewables, and it's getting better with each round. So can we head in that direction instead of more coal-fired power plants that we know have immense costs on the climate level? So it's looking at all these ways to try to bring this model of the micro forward that might be a more sustainable path forward that will work not just for this next generation, but maybe many generations going down the road, because these are huge questions that are just going to continue to be more and more pressing, not just in India, but everywhere.
Thank you. Thank you, Mira. Thank you for that rich presentation and for your patience with the projector as well. I have one question before we, while Francesca sets up Priyali's presentation. You cite a lot of very big numbers about the world, about India in this book. You know, there's 1.2 billion people, 50 million missing women, half of the population lacks sanitation, more than 1 million premature deaths, and 2 billion sick days. And as you say towards the end of the book, you say how easy to forget those statistics are made up of individual lives. But in this book, what I love the most is that you have done a fantastic job of interweaving all of these really big, scary numbers with your stories of the people that both humanizes and individualizes these numbers. But at the same time doesn't ignore or try to downplay the really massive scale and scope of the problems. I think later you also say a billion plus thirsty people require more than a single answer. They need a million little ones, which is a really fabulous statement about, you know, as you were talking at the end, the macro versus the micro. So I'm really interested, how did you strike that balance between telling this big picture story and with all of these small scale ones?
Yeah, that is the question, because like in graduate school, they taught us like information is the death of narrative. As soon as you bring in the facts, everybody's eyes glaze over and the reader just wants to like move to the next thing where you're back with those people who are so interesting. So I tried to strike that balance by slight sucker punches of narration, where I tried to make people interested in the people, and then to bring in the numbers, because the numbers are important. They are what give us the perspective, because we have to, as humans, we care about individuals, and it is just way too easy to forget that when I throw out 4 million people die from cook stoves, that it means that woman that I met in that kitchen on Christmas morning, you know, cooking that one meal. Like that, it's those individuals. So it was tricky, because I was getting into some hard science. You know, I've had, you know, relatives who are reading the book who do not read books like this or think about these things at all say, that was, yeah, really, there was a lot of big letter words and stuff in that first section. and there is that there, but I tried to make it so that even if you didn't want to go there, you got the sense of what was happening. To hopefully, I mean, I wanted to write this for general readership. I hope that this reaches beyond just people like us who come to the Woodrow Wilson Center because we're actively engaged in thinking about these issues. But I would be very joyous if this was something that made other people think who are not normally thinking about it. And I felt like that happened with the vulture story. I didn't think anybody would pay attention to a story about dying vultures in India. Talk about a non-charismatic, non-mega fauna. And yet, people found interest in it. So I think that there are things in all of us that look for these stories.
Oh, that's great. Well, I'm sure this book will find that audience. We're going to turn to Priyali Sir, who's a journalist and documentary filmmaker. For 10 years, she reported from India for CNN, IVN, and Times Now, and she was a Fulbright Humphrey Fellow at the University of Maryland Merrill College School of Journalism last year, where she focused on gender rights, climate change, and policy. So now Priyali's going to tell us a little bit about her reporting from India.
So as Megan said, I used to be a television journalist, so I'm used to technical failure, but I hope the PowerPoint doesn't die on me. Francesca has been kind enough to use the clicker. So as a television journalist and a documentary filmmaker, I'm used to the visual medium. And when I was reading Meera's book, I thought it was beautifully written in terms of, it was very lyrical and very visual. It made an India that I know, that I love, and I miss so much come alive for me. So I'll just read like 2-3 lines about it from the book. She writes on page 24, "Organic soil smells so good. It did smell sweet, almost edible, like a wild mushroom, alive. Though the surface of the ground where we sat was cracked, the dirt was laced with the scent of petrichor, the aroma of rain on dry earth." I was just talking to a friend the other day about how much I miss the smell, the earthy smell of rain in India. I haven't smelled that in the US. But yes, what Meera also does is she talks about environment issues, and she makes it very interesting for people who might be both interested in environment and not interested in environment. She talks about the issues in the backdrop of social issues in India, gender issues in India, health issues in India, and all these issues are very, very interwoven together in the fabric of India. So as I talk about the link between various issues in India, I also want to focus a little bit on my reporting, and I want to focus on how issues like gender, environment, food security are interrelated. As a reporter, I've reported mostly on gender rights. And I try to find the link between gender and various other issues, so be it environment, be it food security, be it poverty. And I think what always comes across to me is that unfortunately women are disproportionately impacted in most of the cases. So if we talk about climate change, I just want to give a small example of the 2004 tsunami. It says reports and research later said that 75% of the deaths, be it in Aceh in Indonesia or Tamil Nadu in India, were women who actually died in the tsunami. It was because men were out in the seas, women were back home, they were taking care of the children. A lot of them didn't know how to swim because of the cultural differences. If we talk about food security, 50% of the world's food is actually produced by women, but only 20% of them are actually landholders, which means that women don't have land rights. And I'll talk about the whole food security issue in detail a little bit more later through my report. And I was talking last year to Megan and the new security beat team here, and we were brainstorming about how we can do a report which actually links climate change and gender. And I wanted to talk about the link between climate change and trafficking of girls. And we were very skeptical at first, because we were like, would we be able to establish a link between climate change and trafficking? Would it be too forced? Right before coming to the US, I was doing an investigative report back home in India where I was actually showing the trafficking of girls from rural and tribal parts of India into major cities like Delhi and Mumbai. And we were able to establish the complete trail of how these girls were actually trafficked by traffickers and brought and sold as bonded laborers to cities in India like Delhi and Mumbai. But we didn't have a climate change link there. But the more I thought about it after coming here, the more that link between climate change and the girls being trafficked from that region became stronger and stronger. So I discussed it with the team here, and we said we should go ahead and do something. So we did this report out of Assam. Assam in India, it is a northeastern state. As you can see on the map, it shares the borders with Bangladesh and Bhutan. It's a very interesting state in terms that it has faced 12 major floods since 1950. It sees displacement of almost 1 million people because of the floods every year. Just in September this year, there was another massive flood. 1,600 villages were inundated. 60 people died, another million people were displaced. So we wanted to show that how maybe the displacement because of the floods could actually be leading to trafficking. I was very fortunate that while I was here in DC, I could connect with a ground reporter in Assam who actually helped me do the interviews with the affected population on phone as well as Skype. So I just want to say and show the figures in the next slide. So there's a major river in Assam, which is the Brahmaputra River, which flows down from Tibet and to the other states and comes to Assam and then ultimately goes to Bangladesh. But that river actually supports the agrarian economy of the state. But what it also does is because of, it's seen a lot of flooding because of the upstream glacial melt. And because of the flooding, that's the kind of impact it's had in the state of Assam. A lot of land has been lost to soil erosion, and a lot of land has been lost to flooding because it has turned to silt and sand. So how are actually women affected in this? We started speaking to a lot of women there, and we found out that a lot of women were actually involved in the agricultural work there. So they might not be landowners, but they were the one who were actually doing the agricultural work. So when the land is destroyed by sand and silt, they don't have any livelihood option. And then they have to look for alternate livelihood options, which could be working as domestic laborers, or just kind of finding out a different kind of work. In fact, policy research organization in the state, which is Center for Environmental, Social and Policy Research, came out with a strong study which said that in the state of Assam, Francesca, can we have the next slide? That in the state of Assam, there has been a marked difference in the number of women who used to do agricultural work, and there's been a rise in the number of women who are actually doing labor work. So we spoke to this woman called Usha Bala Das. She was 50 years old. She is 50 years old, and this is the picture of her land. This is after the floods that took place last year. And these are her paddy fields, which were completely converted into sand and silt. So she said that she pretty much has no other option but to actually work as a laborer. So I think this vulnerability which arises out of looking for livelihood options, wanting to get work, wanting to sustain the family, wanting to provide for the family, which I think is a huger responsibility for the woman than the man, kind of makes them more vulnerable, and traffickers recognize this, and the traffickers actually mostly go around the relief camps looking for the more vulnerable population. But I also want to make it clear here that climate change and flooding is not the only reason why trafficking in places like Assam takes place. Assam is also a conflict-ridden state. A lot of victims of conflict get trafficked. There is abject poverty in areas like the tea gardens because of labor rights issues, and little girls from there get trafficked. So it is poverty, it is conflict, it is flooding, climate change, everything which has a combined impact on the trafficking of girls from these areas. Just a few figures in the next slide which show that how trafficking has been rampant in the state of Assam. In fact, it is one of the states with the highest number of trafficking which is happening in India. What happens is that most of the traffickers get these girls, they lure them to go to bigger cities and take jobs. So they take the girls through these villages in trains to bigger cities, where they are sold to illegal placement agencies, and the illegal placement agencies then sell them to households as domestic labor and bonded labor, where they're pretty much paid almost nothing. And so it is a classic case of modern day slavery, which is thriving in today's world. The girls are pretty much sold for only about $1,100 to $1,200. They lose contact with their family. They lose contact. They pretty much have no option to come back. Sometimes a few girls get rescued. Like we spoke to a girl called Mirilla. Actually, all names have been changed to protect the identity of victims. So we spoke to the 17-year-old girl who was trafficked from Assam, and she was taken to Delhi, from where she was sold to an older man who physically abused her, and that she was sold for only about $1,100. We were talking about the interrelation between various issues. So girls are not only trafficked for to be domestic laborers or to be household laborers, but they're also trafficked to be prostitutes. They're also trafficked as forced brides. They are sold as brides. The northern part of India has a huge child sex ratio problem. There are states like Haryana where for every 1,000 boys there are only 827 girls. So there's a huge deficit of women. So there are pretty much no brides. So when men have to actually marry, they get girls from other states, and trafficking also thrives on issues like this. Little girls are trafficked from states like Assam, states like West Bengal, and they are sold to households like this. Sometimes 2-3 men in a family share one woman. So we actually filmed the rescue of one such girl from Assam who was sold in a village of Haryana. I just want to play a short 40-second video of the rescue because it just shows how emotional and terrible it is for the girl.
This family has travelled from Duars to Haryana's Indri village after hearing that their 21-year-old girl was sold here as a bride to a 50-year-old man. The man who bought her is absconding, but his brother admits on camera that the deal was struck for 70,000 rupees.
कितना हजार लिया है? 70,000 रुपए लिया ये.
So actually this man and the girl was sold to this man's, we can stop it otherwise we'll keep playing. The girl was sold to this man's brother, but both of them were sharing that girl as a bride to produce children. I'm going to quickly wrap up now. I just want to say that climate change leading to trafficking is not just an issue about Assam or about India. I think it is becoming more and more internationally seen in disaster-prone areas. Philippines, for example, after Typhoon Haiyan, 4 million people were displaced, and that became a fertile ground for traffickers there. After our report, 6 months later, other publications kind of published the report and the link between climate change and trafficking. And if you don't believe me, Megan, or Wilson Center, or the other reporters, believe the Pope. Since we are talking about the Pope season a few weeks ago, the Pope said actually that the UN should investigate the link between climate change giving rise to trafficking. That's it.
I like that. Thank you, Priyali. And there are copies of her new Security Beat article outside, I believe. And if you want to know more about the Security Beat, my colleague Skylar Knoll, who edits it, is here today, and talk with him afterwards. Now, Lisa Palmer, who is, we're proud to say, is a former Wilson Center public policy scholar who covers water, energy, ecosystems, agriculture, and sustainability for publications such as Climate Connections, Yale Environment 360, The Guardian, New York Times, Nature, and more. She is currently a fellow at the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center, or SSINC, and she's writing a book about people attempting to reconcile the need to feed a growing world without adversely affecting the environment. And you can find more about that at hothungryplanet.com. Lisa?
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. As Megan said, I spent the last year here as a public policy scholar, and it was a wonderful year in which I started my book project with the help of my wonderful intern who's here today, Brianne Rajkumar, who I think is still looking for a job. And she was really instrumental in helping me put my book to do some research for my book. I'm now at the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center. It's in Annapolis, and what I would like to just sort of tell you about is a little bit more of the links between some of the work that we've seen here in River Runs Again, as well as with Priyali's reporting that society's most critical environmental problems are rooted in these multifaceted and deeply interconnected relationships we have with the world. Mira's book does a beautiful job, and I highly recommend you get it, about telling about these relationships between humans and the natural ecosystems in which they live. And the work that researchers do at SSINC, and actually two of my colleagues are here today, Paulo Dodorico, whose background is in hydrology, and Jean-Paul Delangelo, who's a social scientist, is in the back. They could talk to you a little bit more the work, but it's a great example of the work they're doing around water and land rights, and as well as the global food security and commodities trade. But to better understand these relationships, at Succinct, the reason that I was first attracted to going there as a journalist as well as a fellow was because the research that's coming out of there is really special. On a scientific level, the research comes out of there ready and engaged to better inform decision makers on both the local, regional, state, national, and international levels, because they are integrating these issues of social sciences with the natural sciences right from the get-go, right as they begin to understand and explore some of the research questions. And I think through this interface of the human and ecological systems, I'm always, as a journalist, looking to see how I can bring this, develop a way to explain this to a broader audience, to why should we care? And so I think what's really interesting about the work that Mira has done and her reporting is to tell us exactly why we should care, because she's bringing in these rich stories, but also with the rigor of science behind them. I recently had the opportunity to travel to India, to many of the same places or similar places where she reported from, as well as or Priyali has reported from. And I think when, looking, it's a huge country and there's so many stories that come out of there, but one of the things that is really important about looking at these stories is to know understand the place and the science behind what the research is saying and what the policies are doing and having, and how their policies are perhaps influencing outcomes that are in some areas quite perverse. The free access to electricity for many of the farmers has been a really good thing along the way through the tools of the Green Revolution to be able to produce a lot of food in the northern part of the state. However, that's led to pretty much unlimited groundwater pumping with not a whole lot of controls. And so I actually went there to learn a little bit more about what's a new program that's being being started by the CGIAR Systems Climate Change and Food Security Program. It's a Climate Smart Villages program in which villages around the country, really, I think they've got 500 slated to start in Haryana, 500 in Punjab and other places, to scale up some of these ideas of interconnecting some of the conservation agriculture, some farming systems that were more like what the farmers you've talked to, their grandfathers did, the no-till agriculture. Some of the places that I went to in Gujarat were looking at how solar power could potentially replace coal-powered electricity or diesel in water irrigation. But then, of course, my first question was, well, solar power, that's going to be unlimited pumping. Well, that's true. And so, how will they counter that solar power? And one of the ways would be to provide a financial incentive to be able to net meter that and sell it back to the grid. I talked to one farmer who, and this is reported on yesterday, one of my stories was published in The Guardian, and let's see if I have a link to it somewhere. But it was through, I was able to go there through a grant from the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. And so the Guardian story, which I think if somebody, I'll have a link to it later, the Guardian story is really interesting in that I met with a farmer who's getting cash that was equivalent to almost one crop season from the solar that he was able to sell back to the grid. Right now, he continues to, I'm not sure exactly how much he continues to use the solar for his own crops, but I know that for the farmers in other places, some of the other villages who are currently using diesel, they don't have the option to sell it back to the grid just yet because the reason they're using diesel is because they don't even have electricity that goes all the way out to where their fields are. So it's saving them the time of having to actually use this kind of fuel source. But they're connecting it through a microgrid and owning it. You know, they're putting up the money for it because it's that valuable to them. So I guess one of the points that I wanted to make about the Climate Smart Villages story, which I'll be writing about not only in my book but in more articles for other publications, is that they're looking there. It's a consortium of variety of research-driven interventions that are happening at the farm level, and one of the main interventions there is to improve the knowledge of farmers, and the villages will help to be kind of a showroom, a classroom for the farmers to be able to use some of these techniques. And in Bihar, they had one of the main programs is to actually help engage women. And because many of the women are left behind to run the farms when their husbands leave the area to get a job to work as laborers, and so they're left managing the farm. And they realized that the women there needed to have more information to be able to run the farms. And so they included gender-specific advisories in all of these, and they have these climate smart villages in other parts of the world as well. I just happened to visit the ones in India. But the gender component is really interesting, and I talked to the woman who's the lead researcher on the gender issues. She's affiliated with CIMMYT, which is the International Wheat and Rice Improvement Center based in Delhi. And she said that she's looking at through strong research questions. And for her, it really came down to understanding what level of involvement that the women had. And she said that she was quite surprised that the women she was studying and researching had really not assessed. They didn't really think they were that involved because in that part, and that's a very traditional area, and men traditionally are considered the heads of households. And when you do a study like this, looking at women's involvement, it's often looked at in a conventional way of looking at male head of household and female head of household, and that really doesn't happen. And so they actually looked at women and men in the same household, what were the roles, and looked at how the women actually did, in many cases, 40% of the work, but that went unacknowledged until they started looking into it. And they're like, oh, actually, we do a lot. We do the planting. We do if they're not using machinery to seed and so on. And this was specifically for wheat production, and she has similar. So she wrote a paper on it. So if you want to look it up, or I can send you the link to it. Her name is Sarabhi Mittal, and it's the gender and wheat planting in India as well as Afghanistan. She looked at that as well. So for women, it was really the inventory of work, and they're looking at how can they reach and better educate women. It's just, a lot of this capacity building and understanding what women's role is, and be able to address what educational programs they have to make them more resilient. And the whole idea around the Climate Smart Villages programs that I got to see was really to help reduce risk from climate change, reduce the amount of inputs that they're doing to pollute the groundwater, as well as get the soil back to being a healthy level. I mean, where I was, there's so much groundwater pumping. It's not only they're using this free electricity, but they're having to go, maybe it used to be only down 10 meters they had to pump. Now they got to pump 100 meters down. It's costing a lot more electricity to do that. So it's costing the government a lot more money to pay for all this energy to do it. They're having to be able to improve the soil content, because right now it's very saline. And as well as to get the farmers to reduce the amount of fertilizer they put on the fields, because the fertilizer is very highly subsidized as well. And so they're currently using about twice as much fertilizer as is recommended. And so I got to meet somebody who's not quite there yet, but they're testing the viability of drones to be able to go monitor some of these fields to actually see how much and provide advisories on how much fertilizer to put on the fields just through imaging from drones. Right now they're using special handheld devices called the Green Seeker. So by using these multiple interventions, using a gender and knowledge base, using technology, using conservation agriculture such as no-till, cover crops, and so on, it really has been a way for them to limit their losses and improve their resilience to some of the problems that they are expecting with climate change. And I know that where I was, especially up in Punjab and Haryana, it's just a major grower of wheat and rice. The rice is a cash crop for them in that area that's sent to, it's basmati rice that they grow, very fragrant and desirable for the Middle Eastern and European markets. They don't eat a whole lot of that type of rice themselves, so I'm sure they keep some. But wheat is their main food crop that they grow for themselves and for market. Wheat, however, has been, I guess, recent studies have shown that through modeling, the wheat yields will be decreasing in the range of 6 to 23% decrease by 2050, and 15 to 25% by 2080. I mean, that's a big problem. And I know, then touching back on the famines that are just very, very fresh in the minds of Indians just before independence, that they've worked very hard to feed themselves, but still there's a huge amount of malnutrition and stunting in the youth, and women are often right there with very high levels of anemia. So they're not in the clear yet, by any means. And yet we've got climate change right around the corner. A couple of other things I wanted to say, there's one sort of, I don't want to say a funny story, but interesting story that I heard through Surabhi Mittal, who was the lead researcher on the gender issues. Talking with her, she was telling me about some of the farmers who were really eager to adopt some of these conservation agriculture techniques, such as no-till. Well, if you haven't seen, I don't know if you're that into farming, I grew up in Minnesota, and I spent a lot of time on farms. Typically, after people farm, you plow the crops under, and you clear the fields and get ready for the next season's crop. In India, they have the crop rotation. Where I was, it was rice in the summer and wheat in the winter. And to do that, they remove all of the soil or the previous season's crop residue, and then they plant the next one. Well, by not tilling, they're leaving the residue into the fields and then planting the next season's crop right in the middle of it. One of the side consequences of that is that sometimes the fields look a little messy. And so some of the women really didn't like this. They actually thought that their husbands were being lazy. And so they were like, the husband's like, well, we tried no-till, but we weren't getting dinner for 3 or 4 days. And so we just gave in because, that was so they actually incorporated that into their agro advisories. And they've now been able to track that the women get, through voice messages, get the same kinds of agro advisories, and so they have sort of a learning information, and I don't blame them if they don't understand. And so it also goes to showing that women have a lot of power at the household level that they really didn't know, or maybe aren't aware that they have, and to be able to support some of these if they had the knowledge. And so it's really important to know that there are people out there that are working on trying to solve some of these issues around the social sciences, whether it's rights to land, gender and knowledge gaps that occur, as well as it's based on very good science. And so I was really pleased to be out there. It's not perfect by any means. It still needs a lot to do. There's a lot more to do. But it was encouraging to see so many people working on this at a very high level. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. I love that last story. So my colleagues will have a microphone or time to take your questions. When you get the microphone, please state your name and affiliation. And who'd like to go first? That's a question. In the back here, in the white shirt.
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah. My name is Trey Taylor. I'm the founder of a company called Verdant Power. We're a renewable energy company. We have a project in New York City's East River that produces both electrical and mechanical power. It's a project that's being showcased in front of the United Nations to address the very issues that you've raised today. And that is the world is moving toward the development of microgrids that are supported by distributed energy resources. And I represent a coalition of renewable energy companies, wind, solar, waste to energy. Our systems convert the water currents to both electrical power and can be used for clean water systems or pumping for agriculture. The problem we have with India is its corruption. We were trying to get technologies in there, and it's at the higher level, and so corruption's getting in the way of us being able to do something. So what I'm suggesting here is the solutions could be from a business economic point of view. There should be economic arguments that we're making to kind of rule the day, if you will. So let me suggest something to you, and then here comes my question afterwards. So excuse me for the long wind-up here. We're working closely with Cornell's University's Atkinson Center for Sustainable Future, creating what will become an informal coalition that will lead to a private-public partnership, not a public-private partnership, because governments can't get things done very effectively, if at all, because of the corruption issues. So here's where I'm coming from philosophically. What we men were to fossil fuels, women should be to renewable energy and developing local communities, because that's where the microgrids begin. So one of the things we're talking about doing is empowering women by creating women entrepreneurs, women business leaders at the local level, because women are more community-minded and mindful of future generations. They then would have less corruption because it's good for the community, not for the man who may be putting the money into a Swiss bank account, if you see where I'm going with all of this. So my challenge to all of you and ask is, what organizations should our group, our informal coalition, be working with to make this happen? How do we gather strength in numbers here to be effective? And then how do we report on it to get the news out, so to speak?
So question about, what about corruption and certainly, Priyali, your work, I know you run right into it. But Mira, do you address that in the book or in your reporting, and Lisa as well?
Yeah, I addressed it a little bit. You're absolutely right. I've definitely met people while I was doing the reporting who were trying to do exactly what you're doing, of trying to implement these systems, and they were running into a lot of problems around corruption and around implementation. Prime Minister Modi partly got in on a platform of development, also anti-corruption. I don't know whether that's going to have any effect. He seems to be barreling ahead on the development side of things, so perhaps that's also happening on some level with the corruption, but it is a huge, huge drain. Specific organizations that you could be working with. Do you know some? Yeah, speak in, jump in, Lisa.
So I had the very fortunate serendipitous meeting with the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. They're based in France, I think, and I was meeting there with some of the top people. I was actually at a Climate Smart Village, and they were there too, dropping by. And so, what that says to me, that growers, and I was meeting with, and I had a chance to meet with Chris Brown, who is the chief sustainability person for Olam, which is a big agribusiness company globally. And they're looking to replicate this because they know the very risks that their business faces with climate change. And so they're looking, they work with, I think, 12,000 farmers in certain parts of India. So I know that some of the people that I met with have worked closely with private entities, business especially, because farmers are businessmen, and it's a business decision. I don't know if you're going to get anywhere with women for a long time in India, because there's a big gap to go, just from what I saw. For many of them didn't want to talk to me. They're still sitting in the back room, heads veiled. I talked to mostly the men. Unfortunately, I didn't have that opportunity to spend as much time as Mira did. This is my first trip, and I hope to go back for a longer period of time. But from just to ground truth some of your ideas in India, I don't think you're going to get a whole lot of traction very quickly with women. It's a great idea, but culturally there's a big gap.
Can I add to that? I think I love your idea about talking about women at the grassroots level. I think that is where change should begin. Is it possible? I agree with Lisa. I know that changes in policies and politics on the larger scale and all of that is important, but I think to bring about a gender rights revolution, it has to be social changes. And I think when you're working with grassroots level organizations, which is what you should be looking at, when you're working with grassroots level organizations, you should be looking at educating younger boys and men. And that kind of value education should actually start at a very young age in schools, where we talk about not just the importance of gender rights, but we should also put in the importance of environmental issues. And so the people who are the next generation, or the younger crop of people, are more educated in terms of gender rights and environmental issues. And in terms of grassroots level organizations, it has to be done state-wise. So when you decide which state you want to work on, I would love to connect you to a few organizations.
Go ahead.
Can I just briefly add, I hear what Lisa's saying about how difficult it can be to get traction with the women, especially in the north, that it is, the gender barrier is huge. I really felt that, like, having experienced, my father's from Chennai, which is in Tamil Nadu in the south. That was my experience with India, and then going to the north, where women were basically in Purda. You just did not see women out in public spaces at all. So there is a big divide. But in the south, again in Tamil Nadu, at one point when I was reporting, women's self-help groups were having a huge impact in the community, and they had a lot of financial power and autonomy within their households and with the income that was coming in, and were using it exactly like you're saying, of what you're trying to tap into. They were using it in ways to better their homes and their livelihoods. So tapping into some of those existing places, that was IVDP out of Tamil Nadu, which is a huge one. He, I'll have to look up the names and everything, but he's won awards for his NGO work, that many of these self-help groups are working under that umbrella. So I think there is some room there to run with that. And then also, just for a lot of the good intention things that are coming from the West, I feel like there needs to be way more tapping in and connecting with the existing NGOs on the ground in India that are already working on these issues, and helping them do what they want to do better, as opposed to just coming in as a separate, whether it's NGOs or whether it's a business, just trying to tap in and make those direct connections, because there are Indians who are trying to do this in their own countries, and they know how to deal with this stuff on some level. So, like, I think that's, I love NGOs, but I used to work in NGOs, and I feel bad sometimes speaking like this, but just like trying to recognize that people are in there already knowing their communities and knowing how to do this, and tap into that. They're a great resource.
Thanks for that question. Another one in the back, Francesca?
Yes, my name is Kami Bhatt. I'm with the Pakistani Spectator. And my question is about this surprising solution. I never been in India, but my parents are from there. In Pakistan, whenever you have this kind of natural disaster, people use religion as a kind of negative instrument. Like, I mean, there are examples when people would let their children, go in the flood just to save their buffalo or cow, because they depend on that animal's income. And I think partially it's because of religion. Somehow they think that, Allah or God would do everything for them. And this is really bad example. I think it's ignorance, lack of education. Do you have same kind of issues in India as well when you say the surprising solution? Is the religion one of the solution in this nonsense way like we do in Pakistan? Thanks.
I think that we need to embrace the fact that people have strong belief systems. Like this can be a good thing. And I definitely saw, I mean, some of the reasons why dogs are a problem in India is because dogs, like almost every animal, is somehow represented in the Hindu pantheon of belief, and they don't want to kill those animals. So like and I had people tell me, and I write about it in the book, of just like, we did this, our Hindu ancestors, they did these clever things. That tree is sacred. So, while we cut down every other tree, that tree is sacred, and we will keep that tree. And you find out biologically that this tree is the tree that's best supported for this desert ecosystem. It has a good taproot. So there's these ways that belief can help sustain those systems. I think there, like here, religion can be turned around and used as a tool in a totally opposite way, of course. Like there's no way to avoid that. But I think that there needs to be a better understanding from the more secular side of the world to those who believe, to recognize that belief is an instrumental drive for people, and that we need to work with that. And that, I mean, it's encouraging when you start getting, the Pope that represents such a large part of humanity speaking out around issues that secularists have been rallying around for a while. So that's encouraging, but I think that that's just one part of that process. But religion does play into it, sometimes positively, sometimes negatively. There's not a very simple answer to that. I'm eager to hear more, especially from Priyali, from India.
I would say that, Pakistan, India, we are the same kind of people. So it's but natural that if people believe that natural disasters God has a role to play in it. I remember reporting on flash floods in Uttarakhand 2 years ago, and it was terrible. And a lot of people said that gods were annoyed because this was like a pilgrimage, and they said that gods were annoyed that the flash floods had happened. But I agree with Meera. I think slowly this change has to be percolated through education, right? And if we can give them the education and the knowledge in the language they understand, so whether it is using religious beliefs, we can use religious beliefs, or we can use the language they understand to actually pass on the scientific knowledge to them, then that is a good thing, and I think we should aim to do that.
I guess one of the things that, and this is sort of doesn't directly answer your question, but it might get at some of it. Some of the farmers' advisories, for instance, that were really helping to change the capacities of farmers were being delivered through they call ICT, which is through telephone messages, not text messages, because of the difficulty with having that being read on a cell phone of different types, but through voice messaging in the local language. And that from what I understand, the researchers telling me that the voice messaging was incredibly useful, because not only from a research side of things, they were able to track how long the men were listening to the voice messages, how long the women were listening to the voice messages, because they had a lot of this data about who owned the phones. But they were able to track that and be able to understand what kind of decisions were being made at the family level. And so, that's the kind of knowledge and capacity building that could potentially be useful as a solution through having these voice messages delivered. And interestingly, one of the points that through the gender study that I learned about, that the men were listening to it the same length that the women were listening to the voice message, even though the men knew about the farming systems and the women had no knowledge. But I think that showed the willingness for the women to learn as much as the men about certain interventions that were being recommended or done, or certain weather advisories or agro advisories. And so this could potentially be worked into that type of system in Pakistan.
I want to add a very small point. I think the media has a very important role to play in this. There are news channels in India, and I'm embarrassed to say this, which actually play up sometimes natural disasters, like the world is going to end in 3 days, the world is going to end in 4 days. I think we need to stop doing that.
That's not just India.
We we need to be like more educated about this. Come on, journalists also need to be passing on the right messages.
That's news we can all use. Up here in the front, Francesca, and then ma'am, you'll be next. Okay.
This is Hassan. I am Humphrey Fellow at the Philip Merrill College of Journalism and a journalist from Pakistan. So my question is about the dams. You mentioned, Meera, about the dams, and since and we know that flooding is a major problem not only in India but also in Pakistan. But we also know that dams construction, especially of big dams, also cause adverse impact on the environment, especially on the river, its ecosystem, and it also isolates some species. So how can we cope with this challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. And just trying to cover so much ground here today. What I'm writing about here and what was happening in Rajasthan was very small scale dams. I think the largest one I saw was maybe about 120 feet across, and that was the really, really big one. Many of them were 10 feet across, or 30 or 50 or something. It was just very, very small scale. And I met up with a researcher who had spent a year in the region. She'd done her PhD studying the Aravari River system and what they were doing there with this small scale water catchment systems, and was finding that their adverse impacts were very minimal. There's the question of, if you keep trapping it everywhere, does the downstream lose out on that water, was part of the driving question that she was looking at. And the answer was very minimally because of these small scale things. Basically, she was finding water that was being dammed here, going underground, and coming up a mile later. So you're talking really about, this is like groundwater recharge system. The mega dams, which is where a lot of the attention has gone, they seem extremely problematic. They're problematic in that the best places for them to be situated are up higher in the Himalayas. It's a seismically active area. Again, when I was talking about the model of the micro versus the macro, these mega dams, they cost a lot of money. There's a lot of fight over land, and the people who are being displaced from the areas where they go into are often tribals and marginalized people already, and there are not good stories about how well the relocation efforts are going. A lot of them, it's not working at all. And then the risks of when something goes bad, it goes really bad. So Modi is also really trying to move forward the Interlinking Rivers project, which is the other way to get water people. Like the water rains up here and it's needed down here, so let's just build gigantic canals and connect rivers. Nature finds a way to make that not work. So it just seems like if you can blaze forward in that direction, or try to be doing something that is, again, small scale but broadly implemented across a landscape that starts having landscape level impacts, it seems like a lot smarter direction to head in.
Francesca, go ahead.
I have just one thing to add. I've written quite a bit about this, and if you give me your card, I'll give you my card. I'm happy to connect you. I wrote for a piece for Nature recently, and there's also a study that was produced from a research team at CSINC talking about some of the future of dam projects and large-scale water structures. And some of the takeaway from that is that right now, many people believe that by developing water policies that have the natural ecosystems to be able to be maintained throughout some of these dam projects is really one of the key elements to their sustainability, and that these large-scale projects are really outdated, especially with climate change and with the changing hydrology. And so I'm happy to connect you with researchers that could help you.
Francesca, right in front of you. Thank you.
I'm Karuna Singh from Earth Day Network India, visiting our head office over here. So glad to be here with all of you. I wanted to ask you, in all your visits, did you come across Panchayat women leaders? Because we've just completed a study. This is women leaders on the grassroots level, and it's taken 20 years for them to come to a stage when they can actually stand up and make decisions. Because although the government of India had passed legislation saying that 33% of the seats should be reserved for these women. All these years, it was their men, folk who really made the decisions, and they just sat on the seats. But now they are at a time when they make those decisions, and we ran a pilot project where we educated them about climate change and grassroots level greenhouse gases and solar energy, and there's great interest over there. And so I was wondering if you had met any of these women and whether you had looked at those possibilities.
I was mostly hearing, I didn't meet very many of them, and when I was asking about it, I was hearing exactly what you said, that many of the times I was hearing that they were still being required to kind of vote the way their husband would vote. But where are you working?
I'm with the
state?
not-for-profit Earth Day Network
But where,
in India. I'm based out of Calcutta, but we
Okay.
cover the whole of India.
so the pilot program you're
Well,
referring?
this was in Madhya Pradesh. Actually,
Okay.
it was funded by the BBC Media Center. They had funded it, and UK Aid. These were the
Yeah,
two.
I think there definitely is a chance that that is going to just start to change. I mean, I think it seems like that it's been a good move to get the reservations, to get the women in those positions, and it makes sense that it's going to take time for them to find any real vocal power there. But I could see that coming. Priyali, what do you think?
Yeah, I just want to comment on this. There were lots of places, in rural places where I went to, where the women sarpanchas were actually just proxy leaders, but that is changing, and you rightly say that is changing. I think it's changing because a lot of young educated women who got educated from villages and who went out to study want to connect back to their grassroots. So they are educated in urban cities and they want to come back, and they don't want to give that power to somebody else. They are authoritative, they know what they're doing, and they want to take the power. That is one. And also within the village, I think women are slowly recognizing their rights more. So I think they also come into groups. They form women's groups within the villages, so where they discuss issues. I in fact visited a Haryana village where the woman was a sarpanch, and they formed a group to stop alcoholism of men in the village. So they would actually police the streets, the roads of the village at night, and made sure that their husbands actually don't, because alcoholism was a big problem. So I think it's a positive step.
I would just add a tiny thing. One of the stories that I researched, I didn't go there, was about there's a village where they claim the highest concentration of millionaires, rupee millionaires, and part of it was that a young educated man who had left, who had no intention of going back to his village, his friends sort of strong-armed him into becoming the sarpanch of the village. And he's like, all right, he's educated, he's ready to live not in a village anymore in a rural India. And so he's like, okay, well, if I'm going to make this a place that I want to live, I'm going to make this a place I want to live. And he took that role really seriously, and they implemented, I think they immediately closed all of the bars. I think that was one of his first moves. That played into it. But then they implemented an entire water catchment system and green initiatives on multiple levels, and basically raised the economy of the entire village. So I think that also the people who are not leaving, who are going out and learning new methods and helping bringing them back to their villages, both male and female, is going to be a really powerful force.
There's a question in the back.
Hi, I'm John Dell'Angelo, postdoctoral fellow at CSINC, where Lisa is a fellow as well. So my question to Mira, following on the small dams, is I've seen some concern in rural Kenya among small-scale farmers, and also in the literature about the issue of spread of vector-borne diseases and malaria correlated with the diffusion of small-scale dams and ponds. What's your experience in India about that?
I didn't hear any mention of that in this region that I was working on. I can see what you're saying, just because you're basically creating wetlands areas that could be a problem for that. But I did not come across that in any of my research. I would love to hear more of what you were finding in Kenya.
I had in something to follow up, another postdoc fellow that I talked to prior to my trip, because I knew that I was actually trying to get to Bihar to go there to visit some of the villages. I ended up going to Gujarat because of just the travel logistics being difficult, and as well as there was an upcoming election, and so some of the roads are being closed. But but in Bihar, they have, it's one of the areas where they believe that there's a whole lot of potential for agriculture to grow and expand once they get access to whether it's solar power or some other type of irrigation system, because the groundwater is really close to their surface. It's an area where the groundwater has not been depleted. But one of the areas, but it's also what happens is that it's also an area that was ripe, at least for one generation, or I think that's what he said, something like that. I can have to check on you the details, but for dengue fever to be, malaria to be very prevalent, because suddenly you're creating very wet soils in an area that wasn't previously irrigated, and so there are unintended consequences to this type of growth, and so it was definitely a concern, and I didn't, when I was there, because I didn't explore it, but that's something, if you're writing on this subject, that is a story to go for. So.
Thanks, Lisa. And I just wanted to add that Lisa's article that she referenced before, the Guardian piece, is outside. There are copies of it if you want to pick up. Before we all adjourn to the reception, I just want to ask you all one last question, and it's about reporting on these issues and how each of you are sort of crossing the traditional lines of the environmental beat and sort of expanding, particularly through your focus on women more than other environmental reporters. And I was wondering, what are the opportunities that have come about that? And then have you been challenged or faced any opposition from others who say, no, that's not an environmental story, or you shouldn't be focusing on that?
I haven't experienced resistance around recognizing it, but it does seem like there is a lack of recognizing what an intimate link they were. I mean, I think I went into this book thinking more about environmental issues myself, and even with what the ether section, I went into it wanting to address population. I actually wasn't thinking a whole lot specifically about women when I went into that necessarily. I mean, like the whole book, I had kind of working hypotheses, and then I just went in, and the reporting sometimes agreed and many times didn't. But I think the fact that I reported while the Malala shooting happened, while the response to the gang rape, and just this, it really turned into like a question of power that came up around that chapter of like, is power a finite thing? If as girls get it, is there going to be backlash from the male side of feeling like it's this finite thing and it's been taken away from them? Is that what we're seeing with part of the stories of violence that are becoming more news? But separate from that also, I felt like I realized throughout the entire book how much the question of women was there, especially with the cook stove story. That was more about women than I ever expected it to be when I went into it. I mean, obviously cooking remains a female domestic task for the most part, but it was very fascinating to me just watching my own transformation of understanding of how intimately linked the environment with women's issues, how hand in hand they really are.
Thank you.
I think I'll talk about linking gender and environment and wanting to do a story on that. Given the fact that India itself is such a patriarchal society, so if you want to talk about population, which is an environmental issue because it's going to give rise in per capita consumption, and you do want to talk about population, but which would mean you're talking about the reproductive rights of a woman. But you cannot talk about that so openly in India. There is marital rape, which is legal in India, right? So it's not a crime. If the government is saying that marital rape is not a crime in India, then where are the reproductive rights of a woman? So these are basic questions that you will face. As a reporter who's worked on field and who has traveled a lot in areas, I remember I was doing a story with a women's rights activist who was a male, and we had traveled to this red light area in Benares, and it had become really late, and we were coming back, and we stopped at about 1 at night. And I remember that there was an incident where I didn't feel very right about it because we stopped to eat, and I felt that I was facing a gender bias situation. So because I was with a male women's rights activist, I immediately looked at him and I said, this is not right. And his immediate response was, But well, it's 1 in the morning. What do you expect? So even when women's rights activists who are male need to open up their mind, I just feel that we have to go through this entire change to even talk about this.
Yeah, this is I haven't written all of the stories from my India trip yet, but I come back at this with a science background. I'm a science writer, and I'm writing a lot more about the social sciences, which is the reason I'm at CSINC, and also because there's such an interlink between the social sciences, the human rights, the equal rights, whether it's gender, whether it's poverty, whether there's so many different demographics that can play a role. I just want to tell you about just the examples of people that I talked to who were there. I had to meet somebody. I wanted to meet her later in the afternoon, but she said, no, I can meet you around 2:30 or 3. I leave the office just after that time. And I remember thinking, well, wait a minute. I think they told me they were open from like 10 to 6. And she said, oh, no. I leave. And she's a professional, a PhD. She's probably in her mid-30s. And she said, no, all the women in our office leave at 3 or 3:30 so they can be home well before dark, well before rush hour, because it is just that hard for the most, educated women and these really top positions. It's still very difficult. I haven't written that story yet, but it's just the reality there. So how do I make that an environmental story? I don't think I do, but it's just something to be aware of, just to ground truth, as well as for me to be able to go to, and again, thanks so much to the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, because these are big issues of our time, and to be able to ground truth some of the solutions with, to see it on the ground and to really realize that big change, I think, is happening, but it will take a while.
Thank you, and thank you to all of our panelists for today's discussion. And I hope you all give them a round of applause. And please join us outside in the atrium for a reception and to pick up your copy of A River Runs Again if you haven't yet bought one. I'll see you out there.